What we're facing at the moment, we're on the verge of a human-wrought mass extinction event. And if we don't act now, it will be too late. Others, but there's good news. The dugongs here in Western Australia are doing really well. I was watching some just yesterday. They're thriving, which is great.
That is really great because they are my favourite as well. And I don't
They're
want to be
lovely.
I don't want
Yeah.
to be sort of selective in a Darwinian way and only save the species I like. But the dugong is definitely up there in my top three. On that happy note, tell us more about Dirk Hartog Island, where these animals are going to be reintroduced. What's the location?
So this is Western Australia. Dirk Hartog Island is the westernmost island in Australia. It is the place where Dirk Hartog landed in 1616, making him the second European to set foot on Australia and the first to set foot on Western Australia. He left a pewter plate engraved with all the details of his visit, which was the first piece of European evidence of Europeans in Australia recovered and was taken back by another explorer 80 years later to Holland. You can see it today in the Rijksmuseum. So
And the island
that
itself,
was
what's it like?
1616.
Yeah.
Yeah. The island is 90 kilometers long. It was separated from the mainland 40,000 years ago. And Aboriginal people seem not to have visited it after that time because they didn't have the means locally to make boats. Um, it's yeah, it's 19 miles from the mainland. It's a very long, thin island, um, and it's recovering from 150 years' use as a sheep station. And the sheep have all been removed. And now the natural vegetation, the native vegetation, is growing again and growing on sand dunes that are now stabilizing, creating new habitat for the species which are in the process of being reintroduced to the island. The idea is
And
to restore the yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, but before we talk about the animals being, returned
Yeah.
to that habitat, sheep grazing. Just explain why that has such a dramatic impact on
Oh, yeah.
on a landscape.
Yeah.
Because people would think, oh, sheep grazing sounds totally harmless. Hills in Scotland are full of them.
Yeah, it's not. And even in Britain, many of our uplands are very heavily overgrazed. They crop the ground right down. We're not good worldwide with sheep. We're not good at leaving areas to recover and for the natural flora to grow again. There's this constant pressure, financial pressure associated with sheep farm, obviously, that keeps the pressure on. In fact, what had happened on Dirk Hartog Island is non-native grasses had been introduced for the benefit of the sheep. And whether or not they will ever disappear, that's very unlikely, I think.
So, what sort of creatures, what species would Dirk Hartog have witnessed on his now named island when he first landed in 1616, and what's left of what would have been there then?
Well, there's a lot still there that he would recognize. He would probably have seen the bird species, the ospreys, white-bellied sea eagles, wedge-tailed eagles, Nankeen kestrel, um, some wrens, unusual wrens. There's a black and white winged wren, which is tiny. It looks like a butterfly. I saw one of those. That's an unusual thing to see. They were there then, and
Sounds
of course, most of
beautiful. The size of a
that
butterfly, I
it is.
bet.
Yeah, it's like in fact when I first saw it, I thought, is that a butterfly? Um, and interestingly, the animals that he would have encountered would, of course, have been marsupials, mostly marsupials. And that's what's being reintroduced. So they're introducing animals which sound really exotic to European ears. The dibbler. My favorite is the Wailoy, which is a tiny little marsupial, which is critically endangered. So it's wonderful that it's being given a place to for its numbers to increase on. And little wallabies, small wallabies. They have what they're called hair wallabies. There's the rufous hair wallaby, the banded hair wallaby. There are types of bandicoots. So all sorts of creatures which are Australian. I mean, they're very different
Mm.
and unusual to people from the Northern Hemisphere.
None of this sounds cheap. Where's this initiative come from, and who's supporting it, and how did they manage to get agreement to get all the sheep off the island, and how are you changing the habitat so that it can sustain these other species? So many questions. I loaded them all into one there. I don't know why.
It's a it's a good news story, Mariella. 70 years ago, the idea was mooted, and the initial efforts were made 50 years ago by the family who live on the island. But everything was stacked against them. It was about 10 years ago that the island became a national park, and at that point, the opportunity, the funding, and the expertise all lined up. It was the perfect alignment, and so the project began. Uh, and it's doing really well. I mean, it's fantastic. Um,
And
Today,
go on.
yeah,
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that the family who live on the island run a lodge there now. They've moved over to tourism, and they do a really good job. I mean, they're fantastic. They're great custodians. So the only people who live on the island is one family and rangers from the national park. But you can visit it, and I think that's, to me, is I think it's really important that people and nature have an opportunity to understand each other. Very often, when islands are used as reserves, people are totally excluded, very often for good reasons. But here it's a national park. People can visit in very strict and controlled ways, and the numbers are limited. You can go with a 4x4 and camp on the island, various campsites. So there's still the opportunity for people to go and enjoy and benefit spiritually from the experience of seeing this restoration work in progress.
But Ray, do you worry that that turns it into a sort of wildlife park? I mean, that turns it into a kind of long lead or something, doesn't it? Rather than a sort of a
No.
wilderness that's been a rewilded wilderness.
It's wild, let me tell you. It's a big place. It's always going to be wild. This is Australia. It's not going to become a theme park. The numbers are strictly limited, and you don't bump into another soul when you're there. And also, there's good history there to be explored. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important to understand that worldwide, wildlife will only survive where it can actually pay its way. So, if that helps in some way for the funding of the project, to the justification of the national park, then it's important.
What do you mean wildlife will only survive if it can pay its way? That sounds pretty
Well,
brutal.
it's not so. Yeah, it's not such a. It doesn't really apply so much to Dirk Hartog Island, but in other parts of the world, in Africa, the pressures on wild country and wildlife are immense. And when you have impoverished communities who are struggling to farm, particularly in the face perhaps of global warming, you can understand that if there are animals that will eat their crops, I'm thinking very much in terms of Africa, um, they will act to eradicate those animals. But if you can provide them with funding associated with tourism, um, then of course there's a rational reason to maintain those populations
Mm.
of wildlife,
But
and we are spreading out.
is that not the system that hasn't worked up till now? Doesn't it behove us, mankind, in the face of global warming and the gradual extinction of so many different species? Shouldn't we be doing something a lot more enterprising than choosing what survives and what doesn't, and what areas flourish and what areas don't, dependent on whether or not they're appealing to tourism? I mean, surely this should be a sort of global initiative that finds designated parts of the world. I mean, it just feels that that's not ambitious enough, and is perhaps too
I
financially
I
based.
hear what you
Mm.
I hear what you're saying, and idealistically, I agree with you. But the wildlife will disappear before we make our ideals work. We have to be realists. What we're facing at the moment, we're on the verge of a human-wrought mass extinction event, and if we don't act now, it will be too late. Um, Idealistically, I completely agree with you. We shouldn't have to have rationales for why something survives. But right now, we need to save them. Let's save the animals. Then we can discuss the ideals later. If we sit around and try to agree on things at the moment, it won't happen. We're not good as a species at all getting together and agreeing on anything. So I think that we have to be really pragmatic right now. Now is not the time for high ideals. It's the moment for practical solutions.
I think your microphone might have got a bit covered by your puffer
Oh,
jacket there. It looks like it's a bit
sorry about.
chilly in Western Australia, by the
Yeah,
way. I'm
it
sitting
is
here in a
now.
summer frock, and you're in what looks like a sort of survival jacket.
You're not wrong. It's cold here now.
Um,
This is the end of Australia's winter. So yeah.
Okay. There was an interesting piece in the Times by science editor Tom Whipple about Thomas Austin, who in 1859 shipped rabbits from the UK to Australia so that he could hunt. I'm just thinking back to our sheep and your island, and it was a shipment that went terribly wrong and led to this huge infestation. I guess it's a very good and solid example, even if it's way in the past, of how delicate ecosystems are and how much we have to bear that in mind in terms of what we use our land for.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I mean, the other classic example, of course, is the cane toad that was sent to Queensland to reduce pest infestation on the sugarcane. The cane toads never got to grips with that in any way, shape, or form, and they're toxic at every stage of their life to all forms of wildlife, from small things to large things. And they've caused an absolute nightmare in Australia. And although there are some indications that some of the wildlife may be getting used to them and avoiding them, but exactly, it's very dangerous to play God.